It's an incredibly poignant confession of St. Paul, making himself vulnerable to everyone, admitting he has a weakness. I'm sure he had great willpower in many areas of his life. I'm sure he was a very virtuous person, but he was given this one thorn in the side, okay? Some sort of bodily affliction, perhaps. But according to St. Augustine, anyway, he thinks it was some form of concupiscence of some kind, okay? In other words, an enticement of his flesh. What it is, we'll find out when we get to the other side, okay? But his words are so incredibly relevant to our lives when he says this: "My grace is sufficient for you," the Lord tells him. "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." So St. Paul says, "I will gladly boast of my weaknesses, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For when I am weak, then I am strong." That is like a non sequitur. It's like a great paradox. What are you talking about? In my weakness, I'm strong. When I'm weak, I'm strong. Does fire come out of water? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Okay? But it does, insofar as a properly ordered person, even when they use even the proper use of their will, is always grounded, rooted in the soil of God's grace, always. And we never turn our eyes away from the Lord. Even when we exercise our will that God gave us, we know the origin of that will, the cause of our will, is God's grace, always. We can't lose sight of that. Once we do, we're set up like a bowling pin. It's the great lesson of salvation history, the reliance upon the grace of God, always. Remaining in the presence of God, keeping our eyes fixed on the Lord. So powerlessness, in 12-step programs, we call this step 1, an admission of powerlessness. Okay, and this is deeply biblical, as we see in today's reading from 2 Corinthians. But let's just hear a little sampling of what the scriptures say on this very point. Step 1. Sirach: "The beginning of the pride of man is to fall off from God, because his heart has departed from him that made him. For pride is the beginning of all sin." That's why the Blessed Mother was sinless, because she had no pride. She never took her eyes off the Lord. Like the eyes of a maid on the hand of her mistress. Okay, she just was fixed on the Lord. She never unplugged from that power source. Unfortunately, we do, and that's the beginning of sin. We call that unplugging, that turning away from the Lord, departing from the Lord, has a name. We call it pride, the root of all vice. Pride is the beginning of all sin. So the Lord has to break the pride of our power, it says in Leviticus, and therefore he lets us undergo chastisements, even deportations, like we see in the first reading there in Ezekiel. There, he's prophesying in Babylon, for crying out loud. Okay, the Lord is trying to break their obstinate and stubborn hearts, this rebellious house of Israel. "I will break the pride of your power, allow you to experience the consequences of your sin, of your obstinate hearts." Now, here's one of my favorites. In Deuteronomy, Moses says, "For the Lord, he will vindicate his people and have compassion on his servants, when he sees that their power is gone." So the Lord is drawn to weakness. He knows how weak we are without him. He just wants us to get that and to turn back to him. And he's right there with his compassion and his mercy. But sometimes he has to let us wrestle with a thorn until we admit our powerlessness over some area of our life, and we tout ourselves as being successful in all kinds of areas, and we have such strong willpower in all kinds of different areas of our life except one, some thorn. The Lord lets us wrestle and struggle with that so that we turn to Him, so that His power will rest upon us, to break the pride of our power. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous says this: lack of power, that was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live. And it had to be a power greater than ourselves, which would solve our problem. Hence, the higher power, namely God. So, alcoholics are the experts, man, and all addicts of all kinds. Think of all the spin-offs of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now you have 12-step programs for everything under the sun. All kinds of human struggle, okay, with entrenched sin in their life, with vice they can't seem to overcome by their own power of will and intellect. Just is totally inadequate. So Alcoholics Anonymous, they're the experts on dealing with this, and their principles are solidly biblical. So addicts run out there, play with the chemistry set, run the experiment over again and again, thinking they're going to get a different result. And they pour the compounds together and boom, it explodes in their face. And they relapse time and again with the same old human efforts, okay, without the reliance upon the grace of God. This is what happens. They end in relapse until they hit a bottom. So what's the bottom going to be for all of us with whatever this thorn is for all of us? We got to hit bottom, rock bottom. Sometimes that's what it takes. People have different bottoms. We have different bottoms, but at a certain point, He's going to break the pride of our power in some given area of our life. So here's the crux of the issue: that we can form all kinds of convictions. We leave the confessional and we form all kinds of convictions, and we have all sorts of rational arguments we formulate in our mind, and we leave, we're on guard, convinced that we want this thorn gone from us. However, something interesting occurs. We call this, and Alcoholics Anonymous refers to this as a mental blank spot. I like this. When the phenomenon of craving kicks in, with whatever it is, once that kicks in, it short circuits all those convictions and resolutions and sound arguments. Just go out the window. We can't seem to summon them with sufficient force in that moment of craving, okay? When the phenomenon of craving hits, that's the problem. Leads to relapse because there's a mental blank spot. And the insanity kicks in and a person relapses. So, step 2. Once we've realized, okay, I can't seem to punch through this thorn. I can't seem to break free of something because I cave in. And I've done it so many times, it's like a well-worn path of my personal behavior, doing this over and over. My will is so weakened in this given area. Okay, what do I do now? I'm powerless. Once we really admit we're powerless, that's step 1. I can't seem to do this. Then we can move on to step 2. Step 2 is coming to believe that God has the power. God has the power. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. Is step 2 of 12-step programs. All right. How about some scripture passages to back this up? Power belongs to God. I like that verse in Psalm 62. He is the Wizard of Oz. The real Wizard of Oz. I only say that because the word power in Hebrew is Oz. That's how you say it. It's transliterated into English as O-Z. Check it for yourself. It's kind of interesting. So power. Oz, power, belongs to God. He is the true Wizard of Oz. That other guy was just, that's like us. Hide behind the curtain. Toto comes over there, pulls the curtain back on us. Pay no attention to the man behind that screen, the curtain. That's us over there trying to be God or something like that. Okay, so it's just a futile effort. God is the authentic Wizard of Oz, okay? The Wizard of Power. Somebody find out where they got that name Oz. And whoever conceived of... all right, now... the Lord will fight for you. You have only to be still. I love that when they got their back up against the wall, man. They are in a state of utter helplessness and weakness, the Israelites. It's the great metaphor of salvation history for overcoming, battling an addiction. All of us are addiction to sin. Okay, it's like leaving Egypt and entering into this exodus, this going out, leading ultimately to the promised land of heaven. We have to go through the wilderness, and we have to endure that first period of withdrawal when Pharaoh and his chariots and charioteers are bearing down on us. There's intense craving, and when someone is trying to break free of an addiction, and it comes in waves. First 30 days, the first 90 days, and then you start to dry out from whatever it is. So here they are, they got their back up against the Red Sea, and they're stuck there, they're starting to freak out. Here comes the world's most powerful army at the time, bearing down on them, this huge dust cloud on the horizon. And they're freaking out, and Moses turns to them and says this: the Lord will fight for you. You have only to be still. Let the Lord fight for you. That's radical reliance upon the grace of God. Letting the Lord fight for us. Starts to get at the essence of this thing, this new soil. St. Paul understands. Now to him who by the power at work within us is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or imagine. So when we start to get this thing, the light bulb comes on in our head and we realize, okay, I'm powerless, but God has the power. Suddenly faith dawns on us like, ooh, it is possible to be free of this thorn. God's grace is sufficient for us. I just need to accept that I am weak, and then I can become strong. When the power of Christ rests upon me. So how do we get it to rest upon us? It's like we have to try something new. What we've been doing hasn't worked. So let's try something new, fresh, new soil. I like this example here from the big book, the founder, one of the co-founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson. So he was, really close to rock bottom, and he was drunk in his house. And this guy came over, a former drinking buddy who was just as bad as him. But he came in all fresh and sober, sat down at the kitchen table with Bill, and he started telling him that he's sobered up. It's kind of like something before Alcoholics Anonymous called the Oxford Group. Anyway, it was a bunch of Christians who got together based on sound biblical principles. They started getting sober. It's what Alcoholics Anonymous kind of originated from. And this guy, this friend of Bill Wilson, had sobered up and found God through God's power. And he sits there at the kitchen table and tells Bill this. This is what Bill says. My friend sat before me and he made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. His human will had failed, and I saw that my friend was on a new footing. His roots had grasped a new soil. That grasping of the new soil, I like that. It's a great metaphor of step 3, when we make a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God. Okay, so powerlessness, step 1, believing God has the power, and then putting our roots into this new soil. It's a great symbol of that. When we do that, like St. Paul says later, I can do all things in him who strengthens me. My favorite metaphor for this state of abandonment or dependence, radical reliance upon the grace of God, okay, that we can use when the phenomenon of craving hits. How do we practically deal with that moment, okay? I recommend this image or illustration found in the Bible. I like Moses when he goes up on the mountain. You know, you go into the grace of God like that thick darkness on top of Mount Sinai. Moses went up in there where God was. To me, that's like the extinguishing of all the senses. It's like a state of abandonment and surrender to go into that thick darkness where God was. Most people don't want to go in there. That's why the rest of Israel, they stayed down at the base of the mountain. They're like, I'm not going up there. You go up there for us. We're not going up there. We got to be like Moses, go into that thick darkness. When the phenomenon of craving, we're on guard, we've been praying, and when we're clear-minded, we're thinking, taking the power out of this temptation before it hits by exposing its lie. That's all fine, well, and good. When we're not in the phenomenon of craving, we prepare ourselves for that inevitable moment when it hits. We prepare ourselves by prayer. Pray that you may not undergo temptation, our Lord says to the apostles before his passion. Pray. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he tells them that you may not undergo temptation. You may not fall prey to it. We have to pray in advance of this moment and think sound thoughts. Okay, exposing the lie of whatever this thorn happens to be. We expose it for what it is. That it leaves us with handfuls of sand. Look like this great green oasis in the desert. And but it leaves us empty. And with a bad taste in our mouth, whatever it is. Okay, so we do all that in preparation for the moment of temptation. But then, when it comes, we duck into this cloud. And there's, instead of a white-knuckle willpower response where we're trying to call to mind all our arguments, it doesn't work. Instead, it's an act of surrender and abandonment. We just relax and let the Lord fight for us. It's a new soil. It's a new type of fighting. It's a victory through surrender and abandonment, radical dependence upon the grace of God. I like to think of it like ducking under a wave. You know, you see surfers going out there into big surf, and you're like, how? He's going to get crushed. Look at that thing. It's the size of a bus coming at him. And they just casually duck under with their surfboard and pop up the other side. That's how to fight really intense temptations when the phenomenon of craving hits. We duck under the wave. That is victory through surrender. So if we're powerless to overcome any area of sin in our life, we have some thorn, we can try surrendering to the power of God.